There is a version of war that exists in the public consciousness, a version defined by maps, by strategy, by the clear-cut movement of front lines, and the quantifiable exchange of fire. It is the war of history books and evening news segments, where objectives are seized, ground is held, and the enemy is a tangible physical force that can be engaged and neutralized. But there is another version of war, one that is rarely discussed outside of quiet conversations between those who have lived it. This is the war of the empty spaces. It is the war of the long, silent hours between midnight and dawn, when the tactical maps become meaningless and the technology that modern armies rely upon, the thermal optics, the satellite communications, the drone surveillance, seems to falter against the weight of the environment itself. When we send American service members into foreign lands, we train them to deal with human threats. We teach them to recognize the silhouette of a weapon, to identify the telltale signs of an ambush, to read the body language of a crowd. We condition them to trust their senses, to believe that what they see is real, and that what is real can be explained, categorized, and dealt with. But what happens when that training collides with an experience that defies categorization? What happens when a soldier, trained in the rigid logic of ballistics and line of sight, encounters something that does not obey the rules of the physical world? For many veterans, the most disturbing memories they carry home are not of combat. They are not the memories of firefights or explosions, traumatic as those are. The memories that linger, the ones that cause them to stare at the ceiling at 3 a.m, are the memories of the unexplained, the moments when the hairs on the back of their neck stood up for no tactical reason, the times they watched a figure move across a landscape in a way that no human should be able to move, the times they realized that they were being watched by something that was not on any intelligence report. These are the stories of the things that exist in the periphery of the war zone. The events that fall outside the scope of the after-action review. They are the encounters that soldiers keep to themselves, often for years, because to speak them aloud is to invite ridicule, or worse, to question their own sanity. But the sheer volume of these accounts, the consistency of the details across different units, different years, and different theaters of operation, suggests that there is something more at work than just sleep deprivation and stress. It suggests that when we step into these ancient, blood-soaked landscapes, we are stepping into a world that we do not fully understand. This is trench shadows, and these are the accounts of the things that should not have been there. The first account comes from a staff sergeant we will refer to as Miller. Miller was a squad leader with the 10th Mountain Division, deployed to the Kunar province of Afghanistan in late 2011. If you are unfamiliar with Kunar, it is one of the most rugged, unforgiving environments on Earth. It is a place of vertical extremes, where mountains shoot up thousands of feet into the air, creating deep, shadowed valleys that see sunlight for only a few hours a day. The terrain is so severe that radio signals often fail, blocked by the sheer mass of rock. It is a place where a modern army, for all its helicopters and armored vehicles, is forced to fight on the terms of the mountain. Miller's platoon was assigned to a small, remote combat outpost, a cop perched on a terraced slope overlooking a minor valley. The cop was barely a base. It was little more than a collection of sandbags, HESCO barriers, and plywood hooches surrounded by triple-strand concertina wire. It was isolated. The nearest support was a 40-minute flight away, weather permitting. The winter when the snows came down from the Hindu Kush, the cop felt like it was on the moon. It was November. The temperature at night would drop well below freezing, a biting cold that cut through layers of thermal gear and settled into the bones. Miller's squad was on the rotation for tower guard. The outpost had 3 guard towers, positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. Miller was in Tower 2, the highest point on the perimeter, which offered a view of the ridgeline to the north. The shift started at 200 hours. The dog watch. The valley below was pitch black, a void of silence. Above, the stars were incredibly bright, hard points of light that offered no warmth. Miller was up in the tower with a younger soldier, a private first class named Gallows. They were running a standard cycle, 15 minutes on the thermal optic, 15 minutes on the PV's 14 night vision, and then a quick break to rest the eyes. Staring through night vision devices nods for hours on end does strange things to the brain. The world becomes a flat, green phosphor hallucination. Depth perception vanishes, shadows stretch and warp. The visual static known as scintillation looks like swarms of insects moving across the screen. Around 300, the silence of the valley was absolute. No wind, no distant barking of dogs from the villages below, just the dead, frozen quiet of the high altitude. Miller was on the thermals, a heavy, tripod-mounted system that could detect heat signatures from kilometers away. He was scanning the northern ridge, a jagged spine of rock that sat about 800 meters above their position and maybe a kilometer out in linear distance. The ridge was designated as Observation Post 4, though there were no friendlies there. It was effectively a goat trail, a sheer cliff face that was nearly impossible to traverse, especially at night and in these freezing conditions. It was considered denied terrain ground, so rough that even the local fighters rarely used it. Miller was sweeping the lens slowly across the crest of the ridge when he caught a flicker of white-hot contrast against the cool gray of the rock. He locked the traverse mechanism and focused the lens. There was a heat signature on the ridge. "I've got movement," Miller whispered, his breath steaming in the cold air. North Ridge, Sector 4, Gallows, who had been leaning against the sandbags trying to stay warm, immediately snapped up his rifle and looked through his own night vision optic. "I don't see it, Sarge. It's too far for the 14s. Miller kept his eyes glued to the thermal display. The signature was distinct. It was the shape of a man, standing upright on a pinnacle of rock that jutted out over the drop-off. But something was wrong. The heat signature was incredibly bright, much hotter than a human body should appear after being exposed to the freezing air for any length of time. Usually, thick winter clothing masks body heat, making people look patchy or dim on thermals. This figure was glowing, as if it were radiating heat from the inside out. "He's just standing there," Miller said, his voice low. Right on the edge, he checked the grid coordinates. The figure was standing on a sheer drop. To get to that position, a person would have to free climb a vertical rock face in the dark, without equipment, in sub-zero temperatures. It didn't make tactical sense. It didn't make physical sense. Miller reached for the radio handset to call it into the TOC, the Tactical Operations Center. "TOC, this is Tower 2. I have a visual on a single PAX, North Ridge, grid 8044-2021, stationary." The radio crackled back. "Tower 2, this is TOC. Copy. Is he armed?" Miller squinted at the screen, adjusting the gain. "Negative. I can't see a weapon. He's just standing there, facing us." For 20 minutes, Miller watched the figure. It did not move. It didn't shift its weight. It didn't crouch. It didn't pace. It stood with a perfect, unnatural stillness that Miller found deeply unsettling. Human beings are biological machines. We are constantly in motion, even when we think we are still. We sway, we adjust our footing, we shiver. This figure was as still as the rock beneath it. Then, the anomaly happened. Miller blinked, his eyes watering from the strain. When he looked back at the screen, the figure had moved, but it hadn't walked. In the span of a split second, the heat signature had traveled from the pinnacle of the rock to a position nearly 50 meters down the sheer face of the cliff. Miller jolted back from the eyepiece. "Whoa! Did you see that?" "See what?" Gallows asked, scanning blindly into the dark. "He moved. He jumped, or fell." Miller put his eyes back to the thermal. The figure was now clinging to the side of the cliff, a vertical wall of stone. But looking closely, Miller realized the figure wasn't clinging. It was standing perpendicular to the wall. It was standing on the vertical rock face, as if gravity had rotated 90 degrees. A cold feeling, distinct from the winter air, washed over Miller. He felt the hair on his arm stand up inside his uniform. His brain tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Glitch in the thermal unit? Reflection? Was Sprisba tried to rationalize what he was signature was crisp. It was a humanoid shape, standing casually on a wall of rock that should have been impossible to hold on to. "TOC." Miller's voice was tighter now. "Subject has moved. He is traversing the cliff face. Rapidly. Copy, Tower 2. Is he descending? Negative. He's moving lateral, across the face." Miller watched as the figure began to move along the cliff. It didn't climb like a man. There was no reaching for handholds, no struggle for footing. It glided. The heat signature flowed across the rock with a fluid, liquid motion, covering hundreds of meters of treacherous terrain in seconds. It moved with a speed that was biologically impossible for a human being, especially on that terrain. And then it stopped again. It stopped instantly, going from full speed to a dead halt without any deceleration. It was now positioned directly above the outpost, looking down from the high ground. Miller grabbed Gallows by the shoulder. "Give me the spotlight now. Sarge, light discipline, give me the damn light." Miller grabbed the heavy handheld spotlight, a multi-million candle power beam, and aimed it at the coordinates on the ridge. He clicked the switch. A brilliant cone of white light stabbed into the darkness. illuminating the falling snow and the dust in the air. The beam hit the cliff face. Gallows was looking through the high-powered day optics now. "I see the spot, Sarge. It's right on the wall." "What do you see?" Miller demanded, keeping the light steady, his hands shaking slightly. "Nothing," Gallows whispered. "Just rock. Snow. There's nothing there." Miller looked back at the thermal. The heat signature was still there. It was standing directly in the center of the spotlight beam. To the naked eye and the day optic, the cliff was empty. To the thermal sensor, there was a man made of fire standing on the wall. "He's right there," Miller said, his voice trembling. "He's right in the light." "Sarge, there is nobody there," Gallows said, panic creeping into his voice. The figure on the thermal screen raised an arm. It pointed, not at the tower, but directly down, toward the valley floor, toward the blind spot behind the outpost's latrines. Suddenly, the heat signature flared. It grew in intensity until it washed out the entire screen, blinding the thermal sensor with a wall of white static. Miller recoiled, cursing, blinking away the afterimage. He frantically adjusted the gain, trying to clear the image. When the sensor recalibrated and the picture returned, the cliff was empty. The rock was cold. There was no residual heat. No sign that anything had ever been there. Miller shut off the spotlight. The darkness rushed back in, heavier than before. He stood there in the freezing tower, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He scanned the ridge for the rest of the shift. He scanned until the sun came up and washed the mountains in gray light. Nothing. The next morning, Miller led a patrol out. He insisted on checking the base of the cliff, claiming they needed to verify if a spotter had been setting up positions. They hiked up the scree slopes, slipping on the loose shale. When they reached the area below where the figure had been, they found something that stopped Miller in his tracks. In a patch of undisturbed snow at the base of the cliff, there were footprints, but they weren't boot prints. They were the prints of bare feet, large, human-shaped feet with distinct toes. They started in the middle of the snowpatch and ended in the middle of the snowpatch, as if something had dropped from the sky and then launched itself back up. The temperature was 10 degrees Fahrenheit. The rock was sharp as glass. No human being could walk barefoot here. Miller stared at the prints for a long time. He took a photo with his tactical camera, but he never showed it to command. He knew what they would say. They would say it was a trick of the melting snow or an animal track. But Miller knew what he had seen on the thermal. He knew the way it had moved. And he knew that for those few minutes in the tower, he had been looking at something that did not belong to the war he was fighting. He never went back up to Tower 2 at night without feeling that he was being watched from the high ground by something cold and ancient that lived in the rock. We move now from the frozen peaks of Afghanistan to a vastly different, yet equally hostile environment, the marshlands of southern Iraq. This area, known as the Awar, is a water world in the middle of the desert. It is a maze of reeds, waterways, and small islands that has been inhabited for 5,000 years. Some biblical scholars believe this area was the site of the Garden of Eden, but for the soldiers of the 1st Cavalry Division deployed there in 2008, it felt much closer to hell. Specialist Davis was a grenadier in a platoon tasked with patrolling the waterways. Their mission was to interdict weapons smuggling routes coming across the border from Iran. They operated from small, rigid, hulled, inflatable boats, navigating the narrow channels through reeds that grew 10 feet high, blocking all visibility. The marshes are an oppressive environment. The humidity is stifling. The air smells of stagnant water, rotting vegetation, and burning oil. The insects are relentless, and the silence is deceptive. The reeds absorb sound, creating a dead zone where you can be 10 feet away from someone and not hear them move. It was September. Davis's squad was on a night ambush mission. Intelligence suggested that a high-value target was moving shipments through a specific sector of the marshes known as the Dark Canals. The plan was to insert by boat, set up a hide position on one of the small, muddy islands, and wait. They inserted at dusk. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the water turned to black oil. They camouflaged the boats and set up a perimeter in a thicket of reeds. Davis was on the north side of the perimeter, partnered with his team leader, Sergeant Wells. They settled in for the wait. By midnight, the darkness was absolute. The moon was obscured by heavy cloud cover. The only light came from the faint glow of distant gas flares from the oil fields on the horizon, reflecting off the water. Around 2000, the environment changed. The ambient noise, the frogs, the crickets, the splash of fish suddenly stopped. It wasn't a gradual fade, it was an instant cutoff, as if someone had thrown a switch. The silence that followed was heavy and unnatural. Davis felt a vibration in the ground beneath him. It wasn't an explosion or a vehicle. It was a low-frequency hum, something he could feel in his teeth more than he could hear with his ears. He looked over at Wells. The sergeant was alert, his head cocked to the side, listening. Then came the voices. They started faint, coming from the water, not the land. It sounded like a conversation, a murmuring of many people speaking at once. Davis tightened his grip on his M23 grenade launcher. He assumed it was the smugglers. He nudged Wells and pointed toward the canal. Wells nodded and signaled for the squad to hold fire. They waited for the boats to appear. They waited for the sound of engines or the splash of oars. But the voices didn't get closer and they didn't move away. They stayed at a fixed distance just beyond the wall of reeds. And as Davis listened, focusing through the amplified hearing of his electronic headset, his Peltors, he realized something that made his blood run cold. The voices weren't speaking Arabic. They weren't speaking Farsi. They were speaking English. "It sounds like a radio," Davis whispered to Wells. It did. It sounded like a loop of military radio traffic. Davis could hear snippets of phrases, distorted and overlapping. Check fire, moving north, medic, grid coordinate. It was a chaotic college of combat chatter, but the voices sounded flat, metallic, and devoid of emotion. And then, Davis heard his own voice. He heard a clear, distinct sentence drift out of the darkness over the water. "I'm out of water. Pass the bottle." It was a phrase he had said to Wells 3 hours ago when they were first setting up the position. The voices in the reeds swelled. More snippets of their own conversations from earlier in the day began to echo back to them. A laugh, a curse word, the sound of a weapon clearing. It was as if the marsh had recorded them and was now playing the sounds back to lure them out. Suddenly, a light appeared under the water. It was a soft, blue bioluminescence, glowing from beneath the surface of the black canal. It wasn't a reflection, it was a source of light, moving deep underwater. It drifted closer to their position, illuminating the stems of the reeds from below. "Contact," Wells hissed. "Do you see that?" The light stopped 10 feet from the muddy bank where they lay. The water was still. There were no ripples. Then, a hand broke the surface. It wasn't a violent splash. It was a slow, deliberate motion. A pale, wet hand rose from the water, followed by a forearm, then a shoulder. It was covered in mud and algae. It reached up and grasped a handful of reeds, pulling. Davis expected a head to follow. He expected a diver, an insurgent, a threat he sighted in his weapon, ready to fire, but no head emerged, just the arm. It pulled, testing the strength of the reeds, and then another arm rose from the water a few feet away, and then another, all around their small island. Pale arms were rising silently from the black water, grasping the reeds, holding on to the mud bank. There were no bodies attached to them, just limbs, severed but moving with purpose, rising from the depths like a crop of dead things growing in the night. The radio chatter from the darkness grew louder, screaming now, a cacophony of their own voices yelling in panic. "Contact front! Man down! Get us out of here!" It was a recording of a battle that hadn't happened yet. Wells scrambled back, his discipline breaking. "We're leaving. Now. Move! Move!" The squad didn't need to be told twice. They abandoned the hide site, scrambling back to the boats. As they splashed into the water on the far side of the island, Davis looked back. The blue light under the water was spreading, pulsing faster. The arms on the bank were swaying, the fingers curling and uncurling in the mud. They gunned the engines of the boats, tearing through the reeds, risking running aground just to get away from that island. As the roar of the outboards drowned out the silence, Davis looked back one last time. Standing on the surface of the water, not floating in it, but standing on top of it, was a figure. It was tall, draped in rags that looked like rotting nets. It had no face, only a smooth surface where features should be. It raised one hand, a pale, wet hand, and waved. The radios in the boat screeched with static, and for 1 second, a clear voice cut through the noise. It wasn't a recording this time. It was a deep, guttural whisper that seemed to come from right next to Davis's ear. "Come back." They drove back to the fob in silence, navigating by compass because the GPS refused to lock on. When they arrived, they were soaked, covered in mud, and shaking. They reported an aborted mission due to environmental hazards and equipment failure. They never mentioned the arms. They never mentioned the voices. But the next day, while cleaning his gear, Davis found something tucked into the webbing of his vest. It was a clump of river weeds, wet and smelling of decay. Tangled inside the weeds was a single, rusted American dog tag. It was dated 2003, 5 years before his unit arrived. The name on the tag was illegible, eaten away by time and water. Davis doesn't know who the tag belonged to. He doesn't know how it got into his vest. He threw it into a burn pit and watched it turn to ash. He finished his tour, but he never went back into the water. Even now, years later, living in a dry state in the US, he cannot sleep with a window open. He is afraid that if he listens closely enough to the night, he will hear his own voice calling to him from the dark. The weight of the unknown there is a tendency to dismiss these stories, to write them off as the byproducts of stress, exhaustion, and the chaotic nature of war. We tell ourselves that the brain, when pushed to the breaking point by sleep deprivation and hypervigilance, begins to manufacture its own monsters. We say that the figure on the cliff was just a shadow and a trick of the thermal lens. We say that the voices in the marsh were just the wind whistling through the reeds and the power of suggestion, and perhaps that is true. Perhaps there are rational scientific explanations for everything Miller and Davis experienced. Perhaps the mind is the only haunted place on Earth. But then you have to account for the details. You have to account for the thermal signature that moved with impossible speed. You have to account for the footprints in the snow that no human could have made. You have to account for the shared hallucination of an entire squad, hearing their own voices played back to them from the darkness. You have to account for the physical evidence of a rusted dog tag appearing where it shouldn't be. War strips away the veneer of civilization. It reduces the world to its most primal elements: life, death, fear, and survival. It forces human beings into the empty spaces of the map, the places where the old world still lingers, waiting. For the soldiers who come back, the hardest part isn't always the memory of the fighting. Sometimes, the hardest part is the memory of the things that didn't fight, the things that just watched, the things that stood on the ridgeline or waited in the water. The realization that we are not always the masters of the terrain we occupy. Miller and Davis are out of the military now. They have jobs, families, and lives far removed from the mountains of Afghanistan and the marshes of Iraq, but they are still walking patrol in their minds. They are still scanning the edges of their vision, waiting for the movement that doesn't make sense. They carry the weight of the unknown with them, a silent burden that no medal or citation can acknowledge. They know that there are things in the dark that our night vision cannot explain. And they know that sometimes, when you stare into the void doesn't just stare back. Sometimes it mimics you. Sometimes it follows you home. Thank you for joining us in the trenches today. These stories are difficult to tell, and even harder to live with. They remind us that the reality of war is often stranger and more unsettling than any fiction. If you have served and have a story that defies explanation, something you saw on a lonely guard post, or a desolate patrol that you have never been able to fully rationalize, we want to hear from you. The history of warfare is filled with these shadows, and your account deserves to be part of the record. Leave a comment below or reach out to us. You are not alone in what you experienced. Stay safe, stay watchful, and keep your head down. This is Trench Shadows, dismissed.